Hi everyone, my name is Richard. I trust you're all well. I'd just like to welcome you to this week's Thought for the Week. One of the roles that I have at work is to be the Departmental Health and Safety Officer, a coveted role as you can imagine. In cytology we deal with biological samples, all of which are potentially infective, and we use large volumes of volatile, highly flammable chemical reagents. It's therefore really important that we perform risk assessments, cost assessments, and have standard operating procedures for all of our processes to ensure the safety of our staff. Now, we regularly audit our procedures to check that everything's in place, and this includes making sure that all of our fire extinguishers are where they need to be and that they're ready to be used if needed. Fire extinguishers can be something that you don't really notice. You wouldn't use one unless there was a fire. You wouldn't really pay much attention to them in the normal everyday. But then if there was a fire, we would completely rely on a fire extinguisher to put the fire out. I'm certainly not going to try and tackle a chemical fire without one. But apart from using them in a time of emergency, they kind of just sit there on the wall and paid very little attention. Sadly, people, including Christians, can use God in the same way as a fire extinguisher. Unless there is a real drama or something really bad is happening, we can attempt to drift along in life in our own strength, trying to manage without a fire extinguisher, trying to manage without God. When a fire starts, we reach out and grab the fire extinguisher, or we reach out and cry out to God. We benefit from the power of the fire extinguisher, or God to put out the crisis, to put out the flames. But when we feel the crisis is over, yeah, we're thankful for God's help, but when the crisis is over, we'll take it from here. We don't need God anymore. And that's the sin of pride, thinking that we can manage on our own, perhaps unless there's a really big problem in our lives. And it's possible that we don't even realise that we're living our lives like this. But do we find ourselves reading our Bible less or praying less frequently when things seem to be going well compared to those times of perhaps real difficulty or even danger? God hates pride. The reasons for that is that pride robs us of so much, not only in this life, but also in the life to come. We know from John 15:5 that apart from Christ, we can do nothing. And we are called to be humble and to bring everything to God, to ask Him for His strength to do whatever He has called us to do. When we think we can manage without God, when we think we don't need His help in the normal every day of life, that's when pride robs us of so much of God's care. 1 Peter 5 verses 5 to 7 says this: "In the same way, you who are younger, submit yourselves to your elders. All of you, clothe yourselves with humility towards one another, because God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that He may lift you up in due time. Cast all your anxiety on Him, because He cares for you." And there are 4 reasons in verses 6 and 7 why God hates our pride and therefore instructs us to be humble. Firstly, in verse 6, "Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand." We should be under God's mighty hand. If we're not under God's mighty hand, that means we're going against God. Our pride dishonours and opposes His might. And let me tell you, there is nothing worse than being in opposition to a sovereign and omnipotent God. Nothing worse. Secondly, the passage says that the humble are exalted or lifted up in verse 6. And conversely, the proud will not be exalted. And that's the reason why God hates pride, because rather than being exalted, pride destroys people. Sooner or later, pride will crush a person, and God does not want this. In verse 7, in humility, we need to recognize that we cannot cope, that we cannot carry our burdens alone, and we're called to cast all our anxiety on Him, on God. Now, pride says, I can cope on my own, I can manage, I can take care of myself. And what this actually does, it ruins people's peace now. We may carry our anxiety or look strong for a season, but eventually our anxieties will defeat us. And again, God doesn't want this for us. And we should humble ourselves. Again, in verse 7, cast all your anxiety on Him because He cares for you. Because God cares for us, we should humble ourselves. When we humble ourselves, we admit that we cannot carry our burdens alone, and this is when we experience God's care. If we do not cast our burdens on God, if we hold on to them in pride, we do not experience God's care, and we are robbed of that sweetest experience of God's care. As lockdown continues to ease, as things begin to return to some kind of normality, well, everything apart from church at the moment, as perhaps the perceived risk of coronavirus diminishes and as the initial crisis seems to be passing, let's not hang God back up on a wall bracket in a corridor and ignore Him until the next emergency, but rather humble ourselves and give everything to Him, that we might be under His mighty hand to one day be exalted and to experience His peace and His care daily, living victorious Christian lives in the strength that God supplies. God bless and have a great week.